Hey guys, we are ready to talk about crisis in the Middle East. We talked a little bit about the Middle East, but now we're going to talk about some crises there. We're going to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're going to talk about the Lebanon civil war. We're going to talk about the Syrian civil war. We're going to talk about the war between Iraq and Iran. Then we're going to talk about Iraq invading Kuwait, and then we're going to talk about the US invading Iraq. First, we're going to go with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, to fully understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have to give you a little Bible lesson. So, once again, I'm sure most of you know I'm not religious. I'm not teaching you about like a religion story, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so deeply tied to religion and religious beliefs that I have to give you the background. So, if I make a timeline. Oops. I'm going to make a timeline. And if I say we're here in 2021, way back here in about 2000 BCE, here we are in the Common Era, before the Common Era, 2000, there was this guy named Abraham. This is Jewish mythology. The Jewish stories that come straight out of the Jewish and Christian Bible. About the year 2000, there was a guy named Abraham, and Abraham did some really cool things for God, and God, in return, gave Abraham some land. And God said, this land will belong to your people, the Jewish people, forever. Forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Your people will own this land. And the Jews call this land the Promised Land. Because, absolutely, we ain't joking. There's no joking here. The Jews believe God promised them this land. Now, I'm going to show you where that land is. Sorry, I didn't have it pulled up already. So, here we are. I'm gonna go a little bit. This land right here, where it says Israel, except it wasn't Israel. It's just a little piece of land right here. And at that time, it was called Judea, land of the Jews, Judea. Well, in the year approximately 200 BCE, let's go back to my timeline for a second. Here's 2000 when Abraham was promised. In about 200, the Roman Empire took over. The Roman Empire, hopefully you guys know the Roman Empire was all along here. all the land in between the sea and my line. So all this was the Roman Empire. They took over, and the Romans oppressed the Jews that lived here. They did not like them at all because the Romans had their own Roman religion, but the Jews had their own separate religion. And the Romans really, really oppressed them, did not like them at all. Well, in the year 63 here, no, not 63 BCE, 63 CE. So about 63 here, there was a big Jewish uprising going totally against the Romans. And the Romans squashed them down, were mean and awful to the Jews, and then forbid Jews to live in that land anymore. Kicked them all out. Said no Jews are allowed to live here. Some of the Jews were sold off as slaves. Some of the Jews ran away on their own. No more Jews. And they did something else. They renamed Judea. They gave Judea the name of some ancient enemies of the Jews. And some ancient enemies of the Jews were named Palestinians. And so the Romans, it was total symbology as a symbol of the oppression of the Jews. They renamed their homeland Palestine. This was a huge insult to the Jews. Then in the 600s, Muslims conquered the land. Let's go back to the map. I'm going to erase this. So all of this was the Roman Empire. But now, in the 600s, all of this land was conquered by Muslims. And Judea/Palestine was here. So it was overtaken by Muslims. And over a course of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, there were different Muslim empires. Muslim empires rose, Muslim empires fell, Muslim empires rose, Muslim empires fell. Always Muslim, just different Muslim empires. All the way until 1317. In 1317, the Ottoman Empire rose. It was approximately in the same place. So now all of this is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a Muslim empire. So this tiny, tiny, tiny little area that the Jews believed was their promised land. It was promised to them by God. They've been kicked out of it, and it's been controlled by Muslims now for what, 2000, well, not yet, will be controlled for 2,000 years. The Ottoman Empire went from the year 1317 to the year 1917. So now, this tiny little area that the Jews believe belongs to them because God promised it to Abraham has been controlled for Muslims for 2,000 years. And the Jews have never quit complaining about it. They've never given up. They've never stopped. They have continuously said, That is our land that God gave us. So hopefully you remember what happens to the Ottoman Empire after World War I. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And Western nations, Western European nations and the US came in here and took over various parts of the Middle East. Well, Palestine came under British control. So now Britain is in control of Palestine. Now let's fast forward to the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, everyone felt sorry for the Jews. I should not have to remind you why everyone felt sorry for the Jews. World War II was a really bad time for the Jewish people. Well, after World War II, Britain went to the United Nations and said, hey, we have a really good idea. Because the Jews had such a horrible time, why don't we do something really, really nice to them? And why don't we give them their homeland back? And the UN was like, oh my goodness, that's a really good idea. Let's do that. Well, the Muslims, the Arab people that had been in control of this land for 2,000 years were all not very impressed with the idea of giving this land, no matter how small it was. They weren't too interested in giving this land to the Jews. Britain and the United Nations didn't really care. When Britain and the United Nations decided, had their meeting to decide the exact border of where Israel was going to be, they did invite the neighboring Arab nations, but they all refused to go. They were so angry. They were like, who are you to give our land away to someone else? So Britain and the UN went through with their plan, and they took this land right here, and they said, this land is no longer Palestine. This is now the Jewish homeland. The Jews get their promised land back, and we're going to name it Israel. So now, and this was in 1948. In 1948, Israel was created. Whew. These countries around here were not happy about that. Jordan went to war with Israel. Another time, Egypt went to war with Israel. Another time, some of these other countries got together and went to war with Israel. Israel's teeny, teeny, tiny, but the way that they stayed strong was they had the support of Western European countries and the United States. They always came to help Israel fight in these wars. Now, Israel did this thing. They're still doing this. I'm going to try to make my map a little bit bigger. Okay, so no, that won't work. All right, so let's say my map, my circles are not exactly perfect, but I need to make them a little bigger than they should be so you can understand what I'm saying. This is Israel. Here's, oops, sorry, Israel and Palestine. Well, Israel started doing this thing where they started. Do you remember when the Berlin Wall went up right overnight? It just suddenly appeared right through the middle of Berlin. Well, Israel started doing this thing where right in the middle of the night, they started building new neighborhoods in Palestine. And then they would build another neighborhood. And then they would build another neighborhood. And they're taking over Muslim, Arab, Palestinian lands. And as you can imagine, the Palestinians were not happy with that. So they already had their land taken away from them. And now the Israelis are taking more and more. And that land that they've taken, that is not officially part of Israel, but they've taken it over and claimed it as their own anyway, those are called occupied territories. Occupied territories. Occupied means it's not really yours, but you've taken it. If I were to get up and go to the bathroom and come back and someone else is sitting at my desk, that person is occupying my desk. It's my property, but they're sitting there and claiming it as their own. So that's occupied territories. Throughout all of this, there's been lots and lots of violence between Israel and Palestine, and a terrorist group has grown in Palestine called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They are a Palestinian terrorist group that commits terrorist attacks on Israel and terrorist attacks in the occupied territories, trying to get rid of Israel because they hate the whole idea of Israel even existing. Now, that's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now we have to move on to Lebanon. So look at the map here. Here we've got Israel, Palestine's here, Lebanon. Lebanon got their independence from France. Independence from France in 1943. And starting then, Lebanon was this amazing, thriving center of culture, music, art, universities, poetry, philosophy, everything. Lebanon was this amazing, amazing place. And something that was really, really cool about Lebanon was that everyone got along with everyone. The Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, everybody got along with everybody. Everybody was hip, everybody was cool. Nobody cared what religion you were. Everybody was great. That started to change in the 1970s. Let me show you why. Okay, so you see how close Israel is to Lebanon. So we've got the Israelis fighting with, let me do my different colors. the Israelis fighting with the Palestinians. The Palestinians have lost a lot of their land because they had lived here before. They've been pushed off. There's a whole bunch of violence going on here. A bunch of the Palestinians come up here to Lebanon. Change my color again. Palestinians come up here to Lebanon. And these Muslims, the Palestinian Muslims, they're not so cool. They're not cool with the Jews. They're not cool with the Christians because as a whole, most Christians support Israel. So the Palestinians that are angry with the Israelis have moved into Lebanon. And they're not the cool, hip Muslims that get along with everybody. These are just Muslims for Muslims. That was in the 1970s. That was when there was a huge influx of the not so cool to everybody Muslims into Lebanon. Well, from 1975 all the way through the 1990s, there was a civil war in Lebanon between the Muslims and the Christians. And it was all started, and like people got riled up and people were angry. It was all from these really, really, really angry Muslims from Palestine that had moved into Lebanon. So they created this anger towards the Christians. And then there was a civil war. While that civil war was going on, in 1982, Israel said that PLO members, PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, Israel said that PLO members were setting up their terrorist organization in Lebanon. So Israel attacked Lebanon. And when that happened, when Israel attacked Lebanon, Syria, this much bigger country over here, Syria got really angry. They were like, we are not having this. And Syria came into Lebanon, took over Lebanon, and ruled Lebanon for 29 years. I'm going to say all that again. Israel, in 1982, Israel said that the Palestinian Liberation Organization had set up in Lebanon. And so Israel attacked Lebanon. Syria got mad when that happened, and Syria took over Lebanon and ruled Lebanon for 29 years. Okay, that's Lebanon. Now, or that's part of Lebanon. Now, we're going to flash forward to the Arab Spring. Once again, a spring is when the people decide they want democracy and liberal thought. Anytime you ever see a spring, we covered the Prague Spring. Now I'm talking about the Arab Spring. There are all kinds of springs around the world. If you hear of a spring, we're talking about they want democracy and they want liberal thought, liberal freedoms. So the Arab Spring hit all across, let me erase some of this. The Arab Spring hit all across the Arab region. It didn't necessarily hit all the countries, but a lot of them. And in 2012, the Arab Spring was big in Syria. Well, in Syria, it turned into more than just protest in the streets. It turned into a civil war. And it was a civil war between the people that wanted democracy versus the people that liked their dictator. And this civil war crossed over the border into Lebanon. Lebanon is here. How did that happen? Well, when you're driving a car, you know when you pass the border of one country to another, you have to show them your passport. But if you're walking through a field, you don't know exactly when you've crossed from one country to another. And so the fighting just kind of spilled over into Lebanon. So it turned out, let me switch colors for you so it makes a little more sense. The Syrian civil war. So we're talking Syrian person fighting Syrian person. They were fighting each other in Lebanon. And a lot of the Syrian civil war actually took place in Lebanon. That was between 2012 and 2017, a lot of the Syrian civil war happened in Lebanon. In 2017, it was pushed back over into Syria. And that civil war is still happening today. There is still a civil war going on in Syria today. And it's the people that want democracy versus the people that want a dictator. Okay. And, all right, we got Lebanon. We got Syria. Now we're on to Iraq. Iraq used to be, Iraq used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And once again, the Ottoman Empire, this is not the exact Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was approximately here, and Iraq is here. After World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Iraq became an independent country. Sorry. Iraq has three main ethnic groups. Up here in the north, they have the Kurds. And the Kurds just want to be left alone. They are their own ethnic group. They speak their own language. They have their own culture. They want nothing to do with the southern part of Iraq. In fact, the people that live up here, the Kurds that live up here, they call this region Kurdistan. And they call it their own country. Now, according to the United Nations, Kurdistan does not exist. It is not its own country. It is part of Iraq. But the Kurds, there are constant rebellions by the Kurds because they want their own country. Down here in the South, you have two other ethnic groups. They're called the Shiites and the Sunnis. Well, the Shiites are the majority, and the Sunnis are the minority. Now I want you to think for just a minute. Think about everything we've learned from world history. And which one of these groups do you think rules in Iraq? Which one of these groups do you think controls the government? Hopefully, you said the Sunnis, and you would be right. It's so bizarre. It makes very little sense, but we see this over and over and over again in the world, that the minority group is the group in control. So the minority Sunnis control the Iraqi government, and that creates a whole bunch of tension between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Creates a bit of tension between the Kurds too, but the Kurds really just want to be left alone. The Shiites and the Sunnis have lots of tension between the two of them. Well, first I have to talk to you, remind you a little bit about the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Do you remember when I talked about the Islamic Revolution in Iran? First, there was the Shah, and then they had a democratic election, and the Shah was out, and Mossadegh was voted in. But the United States helped the Shah overthrow Mossadegh, and the Shah was back in power. But then there was a huge Islamic uprising in Iran, people out in the streets protesting. It was awful. And the Shah fled, and then the Ayatollah rose up. And the Ayatollah declared Iran an Islamic nation. Well, while all of that turmoil was happening, the leader of Iraq, named Saddam Hussein, looked over here at Iran, and he saw that they were struggling with each other, and he thought, this might be a really good time for me to take a little land away from them. So he went in, he invaded Iran and took a bunch of this land in the West. Well, and Saddam Hussein thought they might not even notice. They were so busy bickering amongst themselves. Well, they did notice. And then there was a war between Iraq and Iran. There was a war between Iraq and Iran. Now, while the war between Iraq and Iran was going on, the Kurds that lived up here in the north saw this as their perfect opportunity to break away, because they thought, the government, Saddam Hussein, is so busy fighting with Iran, he won't even care that we break away. So they tried to break away, but Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal, brutal dictator, was not having that. He came up here to the north, to the Kurds, and he used chemical weapons on them. Chemical weapons are poison. He used poison on his own people to make them quit resisting and agree to be part of Iraq. The whole world was really upset that Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons on his own people. Well, In 1988, this war between Iraq and Iran ended in a stalemate. Hopefully you remember what a stalemate is. Iraq couldn't make any more gains going east, and Iran couldn't get any more land going west, and they were just stuck on this one line. And they finally just gave up and quit fighting, and the war was over. That was in 1988. Then in, sorry, let me erase this. Then in 1991, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, Iraq invaded this tiny little country here called Kuwait. Now, he said his reason was he was just taking back something that belonged to him anyway. And okay, like, yes, once upon a time, this little bit of land was part of Iraq. But hopefully you have learned by now in this class that new countries are formed all the time. Maps have to change all the time. The world map is a completely different map today than it was when I was your age. New countries are created. Countries get their independence. Well, this little part used to be part of Iraq, and then it got its independence. Well, Saddam Hussein claimed that he was taking it back. But we all know that the real reason that he took that over was access to the water and the oil. I erased that so you could see that Iraq itself is completely landlocked. Iraq doesn't have any direct access to the ocean. So they took over Kuwait. Kuwait is full of oil. And we all know that oil equals money. So Saddam Hussein took over Kuwait so he could get all that oil money and he could get access to water. Well, the United States didn't like that because the United States is friends with Saudi Arabia. And the United States thought, if Saddam Hussein is going to take over Kuwait, what if he tries to take over Saudi Arabia? That, they weren't going to have that. So the United States went to the United Nations. The US went to the UN and convinced the UN to send troops into Kuwait to kick Saddam Hussein out. Now, when you learn about this, when you hear about this, anytime anyone talks to you about this thing in Kuwait, you're always going to hear that it was the United States versus Iraq. And really, it was the United States versus Iraq, but officially on paper, it was the United Nations. It happened to be that almost all the soldiers the United Nations sent were American soldiers. It happens to be that all the generals and majors and lieutenants and people in big positions making decisions happened to be American, but they were wearing United Nations helmets and they were wearing United Nations uniforms because it was a United Nations It was a United Nations mission against Saddam Hussein that had invaded Kuwait. And the United Nations eventually won, and Kuwait got its independence again. Iraq was out. Now, let's fast forward to the year 2001. On September 11th, 2001, there was a major terrorist attack on the US. You've probably heard of this. If you have not heard of this attack, you've been living under a rock your whole life. I think it's the most famous terrorist attack on earth these days is the 9/11 terrorist attack in the United States. Well, in 2003, the United States claimed Saddam Hussein had supported the terrorists, these terrorists, the 9/11 terrorists. The United States also claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Weapons that could do massive, massive, massive damage. And that he planned to use those weapons against the United States. And the United States brought up over and over and over again that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons, that's poison, against his own people. So if this man was willing to poison his own people, what would he be willing to do to his enemy? And this whole fury was built up in the United States that it was Saddam Hussein that had supported the September 11th, 2001 terrorists. And Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and we had to take care of Saddam Hussein. And the United States went into Iraq, took over, toppled Saddam Hussein's government, captured Saddam Hussein, tried him for war crimes, and executed him. In the end, there is no proof at all that Saddam Hussein supported these terrorists. There is no proof at all that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. There is proof he did. He absolutely did use chemical weapons against his own people. But there is no proof that he supported the 9/11 terrorists. There is no proof that he had weapons of mass destruction. The United States wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And so they got all the US people, the American people, they were all behind this invasion of Iraq because they were told that he was behind the September 11, 2001 attacks. And so that was in 2003. They found Saddam Hussein and they executed him. There is still today violence between the Shiites and the Sunnis in Iraq. Lots of ethnic tension between these two groups. We are finished In your next class, you will have a test on this. If this lecture was long and parts of it were confusing, I hope you will rewind it and listen to it again. Test in your next class.